Okay, so we're beginning a new quarter, and we're going to study two books this time. And I just kind of want to hit a little bit how that's going to go. It's not unique to study Philippians and Colossians together, and it's not been that long ago for us that we have done some study on both of them. But I think what I'm going to do is we're going to try our best to do a chapter a week, and by saying that, I probably just condemned that process, but hopefully we'll be able to do something like that. We have a little bit of leeway in here, and then do 4 more then for Colossians, and then I'm going to revisit, if you will, what we had read in a more of a thematic study. And so you can see how that's then organized, 4, 4, and 4, okay? And go back and kind of hit some of the major themes that are in both the books, okay? If you do a comparative study between Philippians and Colossians, there are things, especially themes, that are going to be the same. Obviously, Paul's writing to a church. Colossae is a little different setup and where they are at, and we'll look at that here in a minute. And we know that, Philippi is basically a Roman city, okay? And so we'll look at those 2 things. And so tonight we're going to talk about chapter 1. And if you have either the worksheet with you, because I did try to put an ESV version of what we're going to be looking at tonight in that worksheet, and the questions there are the ones that I'm going to ask. Okay, so I think there's 10 questions per chapter, and so we'll try to do our best to do that. I have a feeling as time goes on, we won't be able to do all 10, okay, in every single chapter, but we're going to do our best with that. I wanted to start tonight to see if you can read this. No, to talk a little bit about the lay of the land of these two. They are not next door, right? I think I have another one that kind of shows a little better. Does anyone know how far it is from Colossae to Philippi as the crow flies, as they say? About this far. No. But that's about, let's say about 400 miles. You can't walk it. You're going to have to take a boat somewhere in between there, okay, to get across to Philippi. And so this is probably the original, version of, multitasking as you go across the country there. We find that Paul did a lot of traveling, and he did a lot of traveling on ships that I don't think I would have probably gotten onto. And without that, he never would have been able to start some of these. Now, this map, it is an interesting map, but you have to have it in front of you so you can actually read it, because it shows the churches generally where they were when they had been created. See, you have other churches just that had been started, and then you have all the churches that John had talked about in Revelation. And that really is the purpose of this map. Okay, and you can see all the little crosses there for that. But it does give you a feel for the areas that Paul spent a lot of time in, and some of the apostles did. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Philippi and Colossae from, just to try to get a feel for what the cities were like. They were kind of mixed. Both were mixed, but mostly Philippi is going to be mostly Romans, some Greeks, some Jews, whereas at Colossae, there's going to be mostly Greeks. And we know that they then would not be Roman. There's some Jews in that area. If you notice on the front sheet of the worksheets and the guide that I had made, I did not have a modern day version of Colossae, because it has not been It has not been done yet. Okay, it's a mound there. They poke around at it and have picked at it, but you don't have it unleashed for us or uncovered with all of the mound and the sand and the dirt. It's just obviously Philippi being where it is, a strong Roman influence, Roman law, etc. And Colossae is going to be more Hellenistic, which is tied mostly to the Greeks. Right? You have mostly Philippi, and the Roman army did a lot of this, where they would set up a place for their army to retire to. And so there were a lot of military veterans that were there, and a lot of the upper class, if you will, of the Romans were there. Whereas in Colossae and where it was, if you remember, it's sort of in the mountain, a little mountainous area. You're going to find tradesmen. It was on a trade path. Okay, so you have artisans and so on that would be able to deal with trade, any kind of trade that came through that area. And so consequently, because of the population, you're going to find in Philippi mostly Roman paganists, okay, that are going to inhabit that city, that town. And I think this is pretty much true in any Roman city. Is going to be emperor worship, so they're all going to be worshiping Caesar. The Colossians are going to have a little different mix, and in some ways there are a couple of cults or a couple of a different kind of religions that we would look at as extreme. Not that the Roman emperor worship wasn't, but and so some things start in that area, and we'll talk about some of those when we get to it. And the Jewish presence in Philippi, you're going to have no synagogue. It was a very small amount. Do you remember how many Jews, generally Jews, that had to be in a city before they would be able to start up a synagogue? Generally they say at least 10. Okay, so there's not a whole lot of Jews that are going to be in this area. Very strong Roman stuff. Then in Colossae, you have larger Jewish presence there. The Jews aren't going to mix real well with Romans. Okay, so you're not going to find them very close together. Spiritual issues in Philippi, of course, they're Romans first. Okay, so they put their nationality as the if they're going to introduce themselves to someone, hi, I'm Roman Rick. Okay, and so that's kind of what you would find there. In Colossae, you'll find some Judaism, but this mysticism, asceticism, and so on, it's kind of in the infancy where it began in that area, that sort of country area. So Paul visited Philippi on his second missionary journey. You can find that in Acts 16. And he wrote this letter to them from prison. As a matter of fact, he uses the fact that he's in prison as one of the teaching aids, if you will, and he uses it and explains how it's actually become a benefit rather than something hindering the gospel. We'll talk about that too. But Colossae, we can't really find that he had visited there. He wrote to them, sent a letter to them with Epaphras. Of course, we'll see that there was a very close relationship between Philippi and the Philippians and Paul. We'll see that play out as we read. The character of the church, it's obvious that Philippi was a happy place. Okay? They may have been, preyed upon, if you will, by paganism and Rome, but they were happy to be able to help Paul. And we'll look at that as we go through. They were generous. We know that they helped Paul and helped support him for quite some time, even when he was in prison. And then Colossae was, some of the teaching we'll find in Colossians is going to be about false teachers coming in, especially Judaizing teachers and so on. It's very interesting when the material world meets the spiritual world. Okay, in any of our reading in the New Testament, and do you know what I mean here? You could, if I'd put geothermal, okay, would that have helped you with this comparison here? What do I mean by this statement? I'll give you a hint. So Colossae was well known. Okay, so yes, I am jumping over Philippians for a moment, but Colossae was well known for having cold, refreshing, mountain spring water. Okay. And this geographical context that you see here is used in Revelations chapter 3, where we see the seven cities, okay, the 7 churches of Asia are called out, and Jesus talks about each one of them, and he criticizes the Laodiceans because they're neither hot nor cold, and so there is actually a geographical or a geological reason for maybe being used as that. There's another little town near Colossae called Hierapolis, and it was hot. It was known for thermal activity, okay? And it's interesting to me because this wasn't very far from Colossae to have this thermal activity going on, and Colossae was known nice, cold, refreshing, okay? So Colossae was cold, refreshing, invigorating. And what do you think Laodicea was like? Neither, right? And so it could have been that one was affected by the other some, okay, some of the sources nearing each other, whatever, but Laodicea comes off with just kind of distasteful, lukewarm water and finds itself in this, bad comparison, if you will, negative comparison about being lukewarm. Not something that we are to be spiritually, is it? That's really the message that Jesus is making here is don't be like Laodicea. So, this first chapter in Philippi, or in Philippians, Paul takes some time here, a good amount of this first chapter, to thank them. Okay? He was very thankful to them. And so you're going to see, Paul's joy play out in some of these first 11 verses here. You'll see that his imprisonment is going to be pointed at, okay, at the same time in this area. And then we're going to see him kind of talk about first fruits of righteousness. The first 11 verses, he takes up then doing this greeting and thanksgiving, and so we're going to kind of pull some, some doctrine, if you will, out of that, some way of living for Christ out of that. It's interesting to me that Paul spends a lot of time expressing himself in a way that one might think of Paul, right? I mean, when I think of Paul, I'm thinking often about someone stoic, kind of bland, and maybe someone not very impressive, and we know that he kind of calls himself not very impressive. But he spends a lot of time here kind of being effusive and talking about the joy that he had in them and what he saw in them. And I think that based on what he teaches us in Philippians, He's teaching them and us through them. That's what he wants, how he wants us to be, right? To find joy in what's asked of us, to be obedient. And then he's going to talk about advancing the gospel. And it's going to be a very unique way that really he's able to advance teaching about Christ, even more so because he's in prison than even in being present with them. And then he talks about, in the last major part of the chapter, about living, that to live is Christ. I think we have, and there's a lot of famous verses we repeat, we use a lot in a lot of our examples, right? And of course, one of them is for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And that, in a nutshell, says what that third bullet is going to be talking about. Okay. We'll look at a couple of verses here in a moment, but we see Paul's joy come out in his prayer here in the first few verses here, where he's talking about thanking God upon every remembrance of them. Always, in every prayer of mine, making requests for you with all joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Okay, so we see him kind of call out two or three things here. One is his joy, his ability to have joy when he was praying about them and praying about his relationship with them. A confidence or an assurance that he had in God's work and in their work, okay, that they were doing where he was at. And then prayer for the love and knowledge and purity of the church there at Philippi. So let's read these first couple of verses here. It says, Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all God's holy people in Christ Jesus at Philippi, together with the overseers and deacons. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So Paul is addressing the entire church, but also is calling out and addressing the elders and deacons that are there as well. And he often does that. Paul does not ignore if you will, the organization that God has put in place for the church, and he sees their value to interact with, especially when trying to talk to people that are in the congregation there. So let's look at a couple of things. This is kind of common, if you will, to how Paul introduces his work, his epistles. He consistently emphasizes his divine calling. He greets the believers with grace and peace, and he helps to encourage them. He almost always, even when he's trying to teach them or admonish them, if you will, and it's going to be negative, and he's afraid of that negative message, he finds a way to deliver it in such a way as to exact the result that he needs from them and move them. And Paul affirms and prays for the churches that he is trying to work with. In the next couple of verses here, where Paul's talking about his joy, let's read this. It says, I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. What does Paul mean by partnership in this case? I think verse 5 would call it calls it in at least the New King James, fellowship, okay, with him. But what is he referring to? It's kind of key, isn't it? A kind of key to his beginning of Philippians. So what did you come up with as the answer? Because that is one of the questions. Pardon? No, go ahead. Okay. James, did you hear that? Okay. Yeah, they partnered with him by supporting him, didn't they? Both encouraging him, but also supplied him with money to live on, and so he recognizes, and it may even have called this out because he's in prison, and it's not always great, right, to make sure that have your name associated with someone that's in prison for, let's say, political reasons, or in this case here, you have, him basically waiting for an audience with Caesar, and so he's now waiting for that, and so let's ask the question: why does Paul pray with joy for the Philippians? And I tried to give you 3 choices, okay, on here. I don't think there's choices in the worksheet, but I always like multiple choice. Sometimes they're harder than not multiple choices, but why was Paul praying with joy for them? Somebody made a noise. B. Okay. And so, I mean, we just already talked about it. This was a practice, okay? And, okay, so because of their partnership with him, we find him doing that, him calling that out, if you will. There's a number of things that he says in these first verses here that demonstrates maybe the maturity, let's say the work, if you will, that's being done at Colossae, because he talks about the fellowship they did with him, and also the confidence that he had, that came from that, that partnership that they had together. And so I believe that the next verse, verse 6, talks about being confident. And so this idea of assurance, I think the New King James says confident. I believe the ESV says assurance, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. That's really, I think, saying a lot, isn't it? About his relationship with them, but also what he sees in them, right? And I think that this is something that we ascribe to, isn't it? That someone would have an assurance or a confidence that the good work that we might be doing is going to be able to carry on until Christ comes again. Now, granted, we may or may not be alive when that happens. But our work can live after us, can't it? And is that not what this is really about in this case? And so while he was early on likely referring to their financial and prayerful support of him, he now begins, I think, to demonstrate a confidence that comes from the good work that they are doing. And he is confident that they will continue in that. So that leads me to a second question. What does Paul mean by he who began it will complete the good work? Pardon? C, God will carry on the work of spiritual growth until Christ returns. I think that this is probably one of the strengths of Paul, isn't it? Because this is how he lives. This is how he operates. He's confident that God is going to work with us, right? I mean, we are a result of God's working with us through his word to strengthen us, and for us then to strengthen others, for us to be able to spread the word to others. Okay, so we're kind of working through this first section here. So let's look at this idea of prayer for love, knowledge, and purity, verses 9 to 11. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. So we're continuing this prayer of Paul's, and he prays for their love to grow. And I think that he says to grow in both in knowledge, but also to grow in the way that we are able to discern what is best. How do we do that? So I think that's also one of the questions. How does love with discernment lead to a pure life? First of all, what is love with discernment? What can we describe that as? There's no wrong answer. Righteous, okay. When he talks about love, in this case, who is that? Who's he talking about? Love who? Love what? Because Paul uses some phrases here, like to live as Christ. Okay, we're going to have to try to understand what these phrases might mean to us, right? And so, what does it mean then that we are able to discern what is best and pure and blameless, and that somehow our love is attached to that? So where is our love? Okay, we are to love one another. I think that's a given. We are to love one another. I think he's talking more about here that their love for God, love for doing what he wants them to do, is to abound. And in that, we see opportunities, don't we? To teach others, to improve, our blamelessness, because we're willing to accept his leadership. Because in order for us to be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, we have some work to do, don't we? And so he's teaching, I think, and talking about them to do that. After he's already talked about their love and their willingness to fellowship with him. And so maybe some of those things are, part of this idea of discerning, having love help us discern what is best, for our purity and our blamelessness. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I've heard Paul's writings described as balancing two ideas that are contrast: unity and holiness. And if you're pursuing unity, and that's your primary good, then it doesn't matter what people do, you seek unity. you're seeking holiness, then unity doesn't matter. You split off all the time as long as you uphold what is pure. And it seems like what Paul is talking about here is the selfless love of Jesus, which is to esteem others greater than yourself, can easily become misguided. That because you love somebody and you're upholding them and their ideals and their values, you lose sight of holiness in the process. And so he's saying you need to love and you need to esteem others greater than yourself, but you need to make sure at the same time that you still have discernment. You still have knowledge and understanding of the holy things that God wants you to have. You have to have unity and holiness. You have to have love and discernment. You have to have both of these things together. And that's what he's praying for you to have.
Yeah, and I'm trying to come up with what that looks like. Okay, because, so let's say I'm going to try one on. I've known many people, they were very good people, okay? And they would consider themselves very religious. And that showed in their willingness to help in soup kitchens, to help give care, okay? Give care to people, so on. But they weren't overly cautious about following what Jesus says to do. And sometimes we kind of create that in our lives, right? That feel good equals, sometimes, feel good equals I'm doing what's right. And so we can train ourselves, can't we, to get to that level where we're going to feel good about things that are right to do. Sometimes we might ignore the Bible, what it says for us to do, because we are then focused on the things that we want to do. Nothing wrong with doing, don't get me wrong, nothing wrong with helping people. Nothing wrong even with going and helping at a soup kitchen, okay? But if that takes the place of following what God wants you to do and listening to Him and adhering to Him, now it's replacing God. I'll give an example, and you always have a risk when you're doing examples on the fly, okay? But so I have a friend who went to a wedding on a Saturday, and it was a Catholic wedding. Okay, if you've ever been to a Catholic wedding and you go on a Saturday, there's going to be one thing done there that conflicts with the Bible teaching, and that is they want to serve, they call the host, right? And so this person I know, he is fairly well versed in the Bible. He's involved. There's some kind of organization called Bible study something. Okay, there's a big organization. Okay, I'll get that. No, I won't give you that name. And there's nothing wrong with studying the Bible, but you have to actually ingest what it's telling you. So he tells me, and the bride and the groom they took the Lord's Supper. Okay? And so in a way, he takes that from let's say, a feel-good place, okay? What love was being demonstrated, okay, there and so on, but doesn't really apply what's kind of an obvious teaching in the New Testament about when we are to take the Lord's Supper and what it's meant for, and where it is to be taken. That may have been a bad example, but it is an example of trading, if you will, trading off what you're going to believe or follow and what you're not. Okay, love would lead you to drop your own idea of that and follow what God says it is. Okay, I'm going to try to go on. So Paul's going to talk about his imprisonment, and he's going to talk about how that helps Christ to be boldly taught. The opposite. It's not intuitively obvious, is it, that that's something that would happen, that God's gospel is going to be taught because Paul is in prison. He's going to tell us about that. And then he continues this idea of prayer for love and knowledge, purity, which is kind of a theme, if you will, in this first chapter. So let's look here at the first couple, 3 verses here. It says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. I'm sure that was not the intention of him being in prison. Okay? But yet, you see the God working through Paul, no matter where he is, right? And so we kind of get the idea here, don't we, about how that would happen. Paul is in prison. What do you think was being talked about in most of the churches? Paul's in prison, right? Philippi was helping him by sending him money, care, whatever, visits. I don't know all of it, but and so now that's known, right, by people there. And he's going to talk even more after these verses about, we'll say, another way, if you will, that's being done. But Paul took advantage of this. He didn't sit on his hands, right? So he's in there, and he sees others come to him while in prison, and the imperial guard is seeing all of this. Okay? And so here he is in prison teaching those that have imprisoned him. How does Paul's imprisonment advance the gospel? I'm going to kind of move ahead here. So it makes the gospel known throughout the imperial guard and beyond. And so because of that, everyone's talking about it. Also, in the moment we're going to see there are others preaching because he's in there. Not for the reason we might think, right? So we'll look at that next. If I can get this to... Okay, so in verse 14, it says, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. In other words, look at Paul. He becomes an example, right? Let's do what Paul's doing. I mean, Paul's in prison, and he's teaching those guarding him, okay? And so you can kind of see, can't you, that, it's sort of like if you're in the army and you have a hill to take and you have someone leading you up the hill charging up the hill, okay? And you get pulled into that, right? Paul is helping them, and they are teaching and preaching because of him being in there. And so how can hardship inspire boldness in sharing faith? And we see that many were emboldened, or in other words, those who might have been silent, kept silent, would allow Paul to become an example to them, and now they get energized, right? And they go out and they teach. And then further, says, the former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, That's those who were not doing it correctly. Not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. Paul's in prison. Good. Let's go kind of make a lot of noise, okay, about him and about what he's doing. Let's get out there and let's preach all the more so that they are even harder on him than they might have been. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. And so he's saying those who are out there doing that are doing a good thing in the end, right? For a bad reason, right? It's interesting. It's great insight, but it's interesting the human nature, if you will, that we see poured out here for us with Paul's letter. And so why does Paul rejoice despite selfish motives in those doing the preaching? And we know that it's because Christ is preached. Even though their motives might have been false, as long as they were teaching something true, it was a good thing, right? A good result. And then in verse 21, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul had a dilemma. Right? He didn't know what he wanted to do. Stay on earth or go on to be with Christ. Right? And so he talks about that very clearly. Right? But he says that if he stays, then Christ is advanced. But if he goes to be with Christ, it's a gain for him. And we see him choose really selflessly, right, to stay and to teach, right? He probably could have made himself exacerbated his problem and led to the point of being death. Okay, let's look here. Okay, let me get past this if I can. Okay. All right. If I am to live in the flesh, okay, which is be able to stay and to teach, that means fruitful labor for me, right? Yet, which I shall choose, I cannot tell. They're still fighting in him, right? He's caught between this. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better, right? But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. So Paul takes the lesser, right, for him. He selflessly decides it's better for him to remain and to teach, right? And so how does Paul's hope shape his view? He desires to depart and be with Christ, but he doesn't do it, right? He knows staying helps others grow, right? And so he's going to do that. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for faith of the gospel. What does this idea of, a life worthy of the gospel, what does that look like? Okay. And I think that we're going to answer that real quick, and then we'll finish just one more after this, and we'll finish that next week. But so we know that standing firm in one spirit and striving together is what that life is supposed to look like. And so he is going to talk in the next chapter about unity. Okay, and it seems, I don't think Paul goes very long without having the premise of unity involved in what he's talking about. And so a life worthy of the gospel is one that stands in the Spirit, right? Striving for the faith of the gospel. Okay, we're going to pull up there, and we'll pick up One more verse out of here and then do chapter 2.